My favorite source of sermon illustrations, which you may have gathered because I think I've referred to it at least once, maybe twice already, and well, it will happen again, is The West Wing. How many folks were fans of The West Wing? Okay, so perhaps you will recall various episodes over the years as I share them. That was a brilliant show, and I've gone through the whole series. I have it on DVD, so if anybody wants, we can have a marathon sometime. Watched the whole series about 5 times. Now I pick and choose. I skip through a few of them, but there's so much in there. And I especially appreciate the first 4 seasons. Aaron Sorkin wrote those the way you fashion a good sermon, where he would sort of start with an illustration and then for the next hour take you around, and at the very end, suddenly you realize he got me. I'm back at the point he was making at the beginning. I was recalling an episode the other day where Charlie, who is the president's assistant, gives him a map from, I think, the 1600s. It's a map of the Holy Land. The president loves old things, antique things, so he's very excited about this map. And his aide, Toby, comes in, and the president says, "Look at this map. This is hand done in the 1600s. It's a map of the Holy Land. It's beautiful. I'm going to frame it and hang it on the wall." And Toby says, "You can't do that, sir. It doesn't show the nation of Israel." And the president says, "Well, of course it doesn't. I mean, that was done in the 1600s. Israel wasn't around then." And Toby says, "Yeah, I know. You can't put it on the wall." Later on in the episode, someone else comes in the office, and the president again invites them to look at the map. And this person also looks at it and says, "Yeah, it's a great map. Can't put it on the wall, though, because it doesn't show Israel." It's a reminder to us that history is a funny thing. You see, we go to school, and often in school we're told that history is an objective thing. If you haven't learned this already, let me assure you, history is almost never objective. Almost never. I would dare to say it is so seldom objective. Just assume always that history is subjective, that history is biased. Let me give you an example. If I just say 1492, there's a response. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Very good. Okay, you all go to the back of the class. Lots of things happened to 1492. The very same event. Oh, we can look at it lots of different ways. Yes, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, not only that, we could say 1492 is when Europeans first discovered North America. Because that's what people have been taught in schools for a long, long time, except those of us in Canada know that, well, there were other Europeans that came to North America about 500 years before Columbus, but they didn't count, I guess. You could say in 1492, European colonists came over and began the systematic colonization and destruction of the Western Hemisphere as it used to be known. Because, yeah, I don't like admitting it, but, well, that's what happened. Another thing that happened in 1492 was the year that the Queen banished all Jews from Spain. Did you know that? And on the 12th of October, the day that usually gets celebrated, either, interestingly, in some American states, it's celebrated as Columbus's birthday, even though no one knows when his birthday was. In others, it's celebrated as the day he set sail to do his wonderful work of discovering America. Except, of course, it was a mistake and a failure because he was headed to India. So it really was quite a disastrous voyage if you think of it that way. But he also chose to leave that day because he was Jewish. Most of our history books don't tell us that. And he left that day to make a point that he and others like him were forced out of the country that day. And he set sail for somewhere new and different. There are probably lots of other ways we could describe 1492, but the point is, history is really biased, depending on who's telling it and how they choose to tell it. And of course, current example that I won't go into much, except in case you haven't heard the news this morning, there was yet another shooting in the U.S., this time of police officers in response to the shooting of yet another African-American person. And all of those stories, as we know too well, have at least two sides every time they get told as to who is at fault and who is innocent and what really happened. And really, there's not two sides, there's probably 50 or 60. History is a biased thing. And so sometimes we have to look at it really, really carefully. We have to look at history and we have to wonder. And this is true when we come to biblical history, especially when we get a loaded passage like that one this morning. And the first clue to tell us that it's a loaded passage is Luke 10, 38 to 42, a whopping 5 verses. You'd think 5 verses, not going to get in a whole lot of trouble here. Except it's one of those pieces that in the ancient manuscripts has all sorts of different versions. We don't know what the original was. And scholars across the spectrum will usually tell you when we get a biblical passage that's got a lot of different versions, it's because there was something there in the original that somebody didn't like. And so they tried to fix it, and then somebody else tried to fix it a different way, and someone else tried to fix it another way, and someone went to one of the changes and tried to refix it back to what they hoped might have been the original. And consequently, in the year 2016, we have no idea what the original was. All that we know is there was probably something very controversial in there. Because that's why it would have been changed, right? Nobody changes the boring stuff. They change the headlines. Now, one of the ways that some have actually interpreted this story, and there is linguistic evidence for this, is that it is something as innocuous as Jesus basically saying to Martha, Martha, we only need one dish of food. We only need one casserole. You're making a 14-course meal here. We just need one thing to eat. That's a very innocent form of the story. Probably most scholars kind of write that one off. But it could actually just be saying that. There's another extreme that a few commentators have come up with that also has some legitimacy. It usually gets rejected as well, but its one comes from the other end of the spectrum and says that actually this is a much later story that didn't involve Jesus, and that's why they fiddled with it. And it's really a story to condemn women's role in the early church, that Martha was trying to serve communion symbolically here. And this is a way of saying women shouldn't do that. Interesting point, except there was not a whole lot of honor given to those presiding at communion in the earliest days of the Christian church. That came much later. And so it's doubtful that in the early days of the church they would have put a text in to comment on that, because it was a fairly innocuous thing, interestingly. Tom Wright, who is one of my favorite scholars, even though he's somewhat more conservative than me, although some have said most people are, so, you know. But Tom Wright, I think, describes this so beautifully. He said, there's only one problem in this story, and the problem is Mary dares to act like a man, and Jesus affirms that. And that, I would dare to submit, is what this story is really about. It's not a condemnation of anything that Martha does. Often commentators have played up that part of the story so that we can sort of ignore the fact that Mary is doing something totally off the wall here. See, Mary sits at Jesus' feet to hear him teach. Normally, only men did that. And it's because sitting at a rabbi's feet was the way you learned from that rabbi so that you could become a rabbi. Mary sits at Jesus' feet, and Jesus doesn't say, Mary, why don't you just go sit over there? You can still hear me, but, I want you out of the way. Jesus affirms that she can sit right there. It's Jesus' way of saying she has every right to hear every word I'm saying, and she has every right to become a rabbi just like me. That's an incredibly powerful, powerful statement. No wonder it got changed. No wonder people fiddled with that. Boy, that could sure have blasted things out of the water, couldn't it, if from the very beginning we had taken this text as it probably was meant to be and said, yes, Jesus affirmed anyone can be a follower of Jesus. Anyone can be a minister. Anyone can have their ministry affirmed and recognized. I don't need to tell you that's not exactly what history has done for 2,000 years, is it? It means that sometimes we have to look at history carefully, and sometimes we have to fill in the gaps. I was recently up in Barkerville, up north of here. I hadn't been there in 48 years, which lets you know I'm at least 49, doesn't it? Hadn't been there in 48 years, and what was really kind of neat is it hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, it's an old town, of course. In theory, it shouldn't change a whole lot, but still. But one of the things that was really intriguing when I was there 48 years ago as a very young child, and I loved going there, I recall there being a very tiny Chinese presence in what was then this restored ghost town. A couple of buildings, kind of incidental. But I do remember them. They were there. I can't offhand remember what they were, but, I was only 9, I think. 8. I can't even remember how old I am. So, I was a kid. Okay, work with me here. What was very interesting this time, though, was to go there and find a very large Chinese presence in Old Barkerville. Because as they've reread history, they've realized the Chinese population of that town was not an incidental little couple of people. It was very significant, possibly a third of the population of Barkerville. They're not sure because they didn't do censuses, and even when they did count people, they tended not to count people of color. But based on a variety of historic texts and documents, they think that perhaps up to a third. Now remember, this was the biggest city west of Toronto. Bigger than Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Victoria. For only 3 years, but for 3 years, this was the biggest city west of Toronto. 1/3 of the population were Chinese. We ignored that for a long, long time. So it's really kind of neat to see that they've restored many more buildings and have done a lot of research and have rebuilt out of old lumber some of the Chinese establishments that would have been there. So there are a couple of stores and a restaurant and a boarding house and a temple and a variety of homes and other things. And that part of the community is very present and very obvious, not an incidental kind of, afterthought. Several years ago, I won't try and put a date or an age on this one, but several years ago, I was in Bennington, Vermont. I went to the old church. It's simply called the Old Church. Predated denomination, so it's just called the Old Church, Bennington. It's where Robert Frost is buried, which was why I went there, but noticed a couple of other gravestones that were really quite fascinating at the very front of the cemetery. They were very similar, your classic, basic, old-fashioned tombstone shape. But what was interesting is one was very old and one was very new. And the very old one honored the first minister, and it mentioned his name and his date of birth and where he was born and the very ship that he had taken to come to America from England, and a variety of wonderful things he'd done in his lifetime, and how long he had served the church, and the date that he had died. And at the very bottom, in even smaller print, it said, and his wife. And that was it. And his wife. So the tombstone that's beside it is about 30 years old. Some folks decided this would never do, and they went and they tried to research all they could find out about the first minister's wife. And they gave her a tombstone. same size as her husband's. They put her name on it and her birth date, and they found out when she came to America. And they found out some of the things that she had done in her lifetime, which was to give birth to and raise an incredible number of children, as many women did in those days. And that was not an easy task, either the birthing or the raising. And at the very bottom in small print, they put, and her husband. It's really kind of cool to see these two. But it reminds me that sometimes we have to take history and we have to fill in the blanks. Sometimes we can't just look at it and say, oh, well, yeah, of course he had a wife, and I bet she was a nice person anyway, let's carry on. We have to stop. And we have to wonder what's missing and put some more there. One of the projects that they're undertaking in Barkerville, and they recognize that this could be impossible, but there's a group that's doing it. There are only 3 women's names in the 4 cemeteries in Barkerville. That does not mean that only 3 women ever died there. But only 3 got remembered by name. The rest were just wife of, daughter of, or it's even unmarked, but we assume that that's who it is because of the position of them. So it's fascinating to me that there's a group that's going to undertake a project of trying to figure out who some of these women were and to put their names on a memorial there. A reminder that sometimes we have to take our history, however comfortable or uncomfortable that might be, and we have to fill in the blanks. Not just because history is missing pieces, but because we have this biblical text that tells us how important it is to do that. Jesus says to Martha, Jesus says to us, Mary, it's okay. It's okay. You can be a part of the story, Mary. You don't have to sit somewhere else. You don't have to go somewhere else. You don't have to be somewhere else. You don't have to be someone else. You are a part of the story. Everyone is a part of the story. Let us not overlook that. When we see history, when we see stories being given to us in the media, dare to question, dare to wonder what might be missing. Dare to see the story from the other side. From another side. Who knows how many sides there might be. Jesus asks no less of us. For when we put other people back into the story, it enriches our own story. Amen.